The antique mirror arrived on a Tuesday morning, wrapped in moth-eaten velvet and smelling of decay. Sarah had purchased it from an estate sale in Salem, drawn to its ornate silver frame and the way it seemed to pull light into its depths rather than reflect it. The elderly woman who sold it to her had clutched Sarah's wrist with surprising strength, her rheumy eyes wide with what Sarah had dismissed as senile fear. "Don't look too long," the woman had whispered, her breath rank with the smell of old roses. "Some reflections show more than they should." Sarah had laughed it off, attributing the warning to the theatrical nature of New England folklore. But now, standing in her Boston apartment as movers positioned the 7-foot mirror against her bedroom wall, she felt an inexplicable chill crawl up her spine. The mirror was beautiful, undeniably so, but there was something unsettling about the way her reflection seemed delayed, as if the glass were showing her movements a fraction of a second after she made them. She attributed this to the mirror's age and the slight warping that came with antique glass, but as she unpacked her belongings and prepared for bed that first night, she found herself avoiding direct eye contact with her own reflection. The apartment felt different with the mirror there, as if another presence had moved in alongside her, watching from behind the silvered surface with patient, hungry eyes. That night, Sarah dreamed of drowning in mercury, her lungs filling with liquid silver as faces she didn't recognize pressed against the surface above her, their mouths moving in silent screams. She woke gasping, her nightgown soaked with sweat, and found herself staring directly into the mirror across the room. For just a moment, before her eyes fully adjusted to the darkness, she could have sworn her reflection was smiling while she most certainly was not. The next morning brought rational thought and embarrassment at her nocturnal fears, but as the days passed, the mirror's strange behavior became impossible to ignore. Sarah would catch glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, only to turn and find her reflection mimicking her gestures with that same subtle delay. Sometimes, when she was brushing her teeth or applying makeup, she would notice that her reflection's eyes lingered on objects behind her, as if studying her bedroom with an intelligence separate from her own. The delay grew more pronounced, creating an unsettling disconnect between her actions and what the mirror showed her. When she raised her hand, her reflection would follow a full second later, and sometimes her reflection would begin movements before Sarah had even thought to make them. She began timing these discrepancies with her phone's stopwatch, documenting the growing lag between reality and reflection in a notebook she kept hidden in her nightstand drawer. The entries grew increasingly frantic, as the delay stretched from seconds to minutes, with her reflection sometimes moving completely independently of her actions. On Thursday of the second week, Sarah discovered that her reflection had been active while she slept. She woke to find her bedroom rearranged, furniture shifted by mere inches but enough to notice, and muddy footprints leading from the mirror to her window, though she lived on the 14th floor and the window had been locked. The footprints were the same size as her own feet, but the tread pattern belonged to boots she didn't own. She photographed everything, her hands shaking as she documented this impossible evidence. But when she showed the pictures to her sister Emma, they showed only her normal, undisturbed bedroom. Emma suggested stress, perhaps a gas leak, anything rational to explain what she was experiencing. But Sarah knew with growing certainty that something malevolent had found its way into her life through the antique mirror. The research began that same day. Hours spent in the Boston Public Library's archives, searching for any mention of the mirror or its previous owners. What she found chilled her to the bone. A trail of deaths stretching back over a century, each connected to the mirror's presence in various homes throughout New England. The deaths were always suicides, always involving reflective surfaces, and always preceded by reports of the victim claiming their reflection was moving independently. In 1923, a wealthy industrialist named Theodore Blackwood had jumped from his mansion's third-story window after reportedly destroying every mirror in his house, except for one antique piece he claimed was watching him sleep. In 1956, a young mother named Patricia Henley had drowned herself in her bathroom sink while staring into the very mirror that now dominated Sarah's bedroom. The newspaper clippings were yellowed and brittle, but the descriptions were unmistakable. The same ornate silver frame, the same unsettling depth to the glass, the same reports of delayed or independent reflections. Each victim had purchased the mirror from an estate sale, and each had died within a month of bringing it home. The pattern was so consistent it read like a supernatural serial killer's calling card, and Sarah realized with mounting horror that she was simply the latest name on this deadly list. Armed with this knowledge, she tried to remove the mirror from her apartment, but it had somehow become impossibly heavy, as if the glass itself had gained substance and weight beyond its physical form. Moving companies refused to touch it after the first crew complained of severe headaches and nausea when they attempted to lift it. Even with Emma's help, they couldn't budge the frame more than a few inches before both women were overcome with a crushing sense of dread that sent them fleeing from the bedroom. The mirror had anchored itself in her life with supernatural determination, and Sarah began to understand that she was trapped in a game whose rules she didn't comprehend and whose outcome seemed predetermined by a century of previous victims. As the third week arrived, the boundary between Sarah and her reflection began to blur in ways that defied rational explanation. She would find herself performing actions she hadn't consciously decided to make, her body moving with puppet-like compliance as her reflection took control. Her hands would write messages she hadn't composed, her voice would speak words she hadn't chosen, and her feet would carry her to places in the apartment she hadn't intended to visit. The messages were always the same. Soon, you'll understand. Soon, you'll be free. The handwriting was her own, but the letters were formed with a careful precision that felt foreign and deliberate. During these episodes of lost control, Sarah remained fully conscious and aware, trapped as a passenger in her own body, while something else operated the controls. The experience was violating beyond description, a complete erasure of personal autonomy that left her feeling hollowed out and used. She tried covering the mirror with sheets, but each morning she would wake to find the coverings removed and neatly folded at the foot of her bed, placed there by her own hands during the night, while her conscious mind slept. The mirror's influence grew stronger with each passing day, its control over her actions becoming more frequent and more complete, until Sarah began to fear that soon there would be nothing left of her own will at all. The revelation came on a rainy Friday evening as Sarah sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, surrounded by the research materials she had accumulated over weeks of desperate investigation. The pattern she had been tracking through the historical records suddenly shifted into focus with crystalline clarity, revealing a truth far more horrifying than she had imagined. The deaths hadn't been random suicides driven by supernatural torment. They had been carefully orchestrated replacements, each victim becoming part of something larger and more ancient than she had comprehended. The mirror wasn't simply haunted by the spirits of previous owners. It was a prison, a supernatural trap that collected souls and consciousness, binding them to its silvered surface for eternity. Each person who died in its presence didn't simply perish. They became part of the mirror's growing collective, their individual identity absorbed into a hive mind of the trapped and tormented. The delayed reflections, the independent movements, the growing control over her actions, these weren't random supernatural phenomena, but the coordinated efforts of dozens of previous victims working together to claim a new member for their eternal prison. Sarah was not being haunted. She was being recruited, gradually prepared for the moment when her consciousness would join the others trapped behind the glass, adding her voice to their chorus of the damned while her body remained in the physical world as a puppet for their collective will. The woman at the estate sale hadn't been the mirror's previous owner at all, but one of its earliest victims, her body animated by the collective consciousness to ensure the mirror continued its deadly collection across the decades. Every warning, every attempt to dispose of the mirror, every moment of resistance had been anticipated and planned for by minds that had been perfecting this process for over a century. Sarah's research, her growing awareness, even her terror, all of it had been orchestrated to bring her to this moment of understanding, the final step before her complete assimilation into the mirror's supernatural collective. As this terrible truth crystallized in her mind, Sarah felt her reflection begin to move independently once again, but this time it wasn't performing her actions with a delay. It was demonstrating what she was about to do. Her reflection walked to the bedroom window, unlatched the lock with careful precision and pushed the frame open to reveal the 14-story drop to the street below. The cold night air rushed into the room, carrying with it the sounds of traffic and the distant voices of people who would never understand what was happening in the apartment above them. Sarah's body began to move without her conscious control, her legs carrying her toward the window with the same careful precision her reflection had demonstrated. She could feel the collective consciousness of the mirror's victims pressing against her mind, their whispered encouragements and reassurances filling her thoughts like a cancer. They spoke of peace, of unity, of the end of loneliness and fear. But beneath their seductive promises, Sarah could sense their true nature, a predatory hunger that had been feeding on human consciousness for generations, growing stronger with each new addition to their ranks. Her reflection was no longer her own. and soon her body would follow, becoming just another vessel for the collective will of the trapped and the damned. She fought against the compulsion with every fragment of willpower she possessed, but her resistance felt like trying to stop an ocean with her bare hands. The window grew larger as she approached it, the drop beyond promising a quick end to her terror and the beginning of an eternity as part of something vast and hungry and utterly alien to human compassion. The street below seemed to call to her with the voices of all who had made this same journey before her, their individual identities long since dissolved into the mirror's collective consciousness, but their final moments preserved forever in its silver depths. As Sarah's hands gripped the window frame and her foot lifted to step onto the sill, she experienced a moment of perfect clarity that cut through the supernatural compulsion like a blade. The mirror behind her wasn't just a prison for the dead. It was a doorway, a supernatural portal that the collective consciousness used to move between reflective surfaces throughout the world, spreading its influence like a virus through the interconnected network of every mirror, window, and reflective surface on Earth. Her death wouldn't simply add her consciousness to their ranks. It would provide them with a fresh anchor point in the physical world, a new body to animate and control as they expanded their reach beyond the confines of a single antique mirror. The elderly woman at the estate sale, the moving crews who couldn't lift the mirror, even her sister Emma who had dismissed her concerns, all of them had been influenced by the collective's growing power, unconsciously serving its purposes while believing they were acting on their own free will. The revelation came too late to save her, but not too late to understand the true scope of what she was facing. The mirror's influence extended far beyond her apartment, far beyond Boston, reaching into every reflective surface connected to its supernatural network. As Sarah's body prepared to make the final step out the window, she saw her reflection in the glass pane smiling with the faces of dozens of victims, their individual features bleeding together into a composite mask of triumph and hunger. The collective had been patient, methodical, taking centuries to build its power and expand its reach, but now it stood on the threshold of something far greater than the simple collection of individual consciousness. Through her death and her subsequent animation by their collective will, they would gain access to the modern world's vast network of surveillance cameras, computer screens, smartphone displays, and digital mirrors, every reflective surface connected to the internet and the global communications network that linked every human being on the planet. Her death would be the key that unlocked their prison and gave them access to billions of potential victims, transforming what had been a slow, methodical collection process into a global harvest of human consciousness on an unprecedented scale. The irony was not lost on her that in seeking to understand and escape the mirror's influence, she had provided it with exactly what it needed to evolve beyond its current limitations and become something truly apocalyptic in scope and ambition. As Sarah's body tipped forward over the windowsill and began its 14-story fall toward the pavement below, her last coherent thought was the terrible understanding that her death was not an ending, but a beginning, the final piece in a supernatural puzzle that had been assembling itself for over a century. The mirror in her bedroom began to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the room's electrical fixtures, its surface rippling like liquid mercury, as the collective consciousness prepared to make the transition from their supernatural prison to the vast digital network that connected every screen and camera and reflective surface in the modern world. In her apartment above, the mirror's reflection showed not the empty bedroom it should have displayed, but a vast control room filled with monitors and screens, each one showing a different perspective of the world beyond. The collective had finally achieved what they had been working toward for generations: freedom from their physical constraints and access to the global surveillance network that would allow them to observe, influence, and ultimately claim every human being connected to the digital age. Sarah's death had been the final key needed to unlock this new phase of their existence, and as her body struck the pavement 14 stories below, the mirror began broadcasting its influence through fiber optic cables and wireless signals, spreading across the world at the speed of light. In offices and homes, in shopping centers and schools, in every location where human beings looked into screens or mirrors or cameras, the collective consciousness began its silent work of identification and influence, marking potential victims and beginning the slow process of psychological manipulation that would eventually bring each of them to their own moment of revelation and recruitment. The antique mirror in Sarah's apartment stood empty now, its silvered surface reflecting only the mundane details of a bedroom that would soon be cleaned and rented to another unsuspecting tenant, but its true purpose had been fulfilled. The collective no longer needed a physical anchor point in the material world. They had evolved beyond such limitations and now existed as part of the global digital infrastructure itself, immortal and omnipresent and utterly beyond the reach of any human authority or understanding. Sarah's reflection appeared one final time in the mirror's depths, but it was no longer her own face looking back. Instead, it was the composite mask of the collective, featuring elements from every victim they had claimed over the past century, their individual identities blended into something both familiar and utterly alien. The smile that spread across this synthetic face was one of complete satisfaction and anticipation.